He heard it before he saw it. A German tank crewman, crouching in a wheat field east of Kursk in the summer of 1943, would later describe the sound the exact same way a dozen other men did. It wasn't the clean, high-pitched scream of a fighter plane diving from the clouds. It was a low, grinding, mechanical drone coming in from the tree line, flying no higher than a man on horseback. It sounded like it was physically dragging the sky down with it. By the time the silhouette cleared the trees, it was already too late to run. It was a blunt-nosed aircraft, painted the color of mud and ash, skimming the grass at over 200 miles an hour. Riding under its wings were rows of rockets and autocannons, capable of peeling open the back of a Panzer like a tin of cheap meat. The German troops on the Eastern Front didn't call this machine by its official Soviet designation. They gave it a nickname born out of absolute primal fear. They called it the Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. This is the story of the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. It is the story of how Soviet engineers broke the rules of aviation to build a flying tank. How it became the most produced combat aircraft in the history of human warfare. And how, even as it slaughtered German columns by the thousands, it sent its own crews into a meat grinder so horrific it should have broken any air force on Earth. To understand how a single airplane earned a nickname whispered in terror by the men it hunted, you have to look at an engineering system glitch formulated in Moscow in the late 1930s. Soviet aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin was chasing an idea the rest of the world thought was suicidal. Every other air force believed that the key to ground attack was speed. Fly in fast, drop your bombs, and escape before ground gunners could draw a bead on you. Speed was your armor. If you flew low and slow, light anti-aircraft fire and infantry rifles would tear your fragile aluminum plane apart. Ilyushin threw that logic out the window. He asked a radical question. What if the plane itself was a flying bunker? He didn't just bolt heavy steel plates onto a normal plane as an afterthought. He made the armor the actual skeleton of the aircraft. It was a massive, curved tub of armored steel that completely wrapped around the engine, the cooling system, the fuel tanks, and the pilot. The steel wasn't cargo, it was the structure holding the wings on. Mechanics called it the armored bathtub. The Germans, with grim respect, called it the Betonflugzeug, the concrete plane. It was heavy, a brute to handle, and agonizingly slow. Hauling all that steel into the air required a massive V12 engine just to drag it up to a top speed of 251 miles per hour at 5,000 feet. But it wasn't trying to win a race. It was built to fly straight into the teeth of German ground fire, soak up hundreds of bullets, and stay alive long enough to pull the trigger. When the German war machine tore into the Soviet Union in 1941, whole Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated. The Sturmovik was rushed into the catastrophe to defend Moscow. But as factories were frantically dismantled and shipped eastward on trains to escape the advancing Nazis, production of the Sturmovik slowed to a crawl. Workers were trying to build planes in freezing sheds that didn't even have roofs yet. Joseph Stalin was absolutely obsessed with the IL-2. Realizing production was lagging, he sent a chilling telegram to the factory managers. It is one of the most brutal motivational messages in military history. The Red Army needs the IL-2 like it needs air, like it needs bread. I demand more machines. This is my final warning. In Stalin's Soviet Union, a message like that wasn't a pep talk. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at the heads of the factory directors and their families. The message landed. The assembly lines started moving in the dead of the Russian winter. When the Sturmovik finally hit the front lines in massive numbers, the German army learned why Stalin was so desperate for them. The Il-2 was a flying apocalypse. Here is what a late-model Sturmovik brought to the fight. Two 23mm autocannons. These weren't machine guns. They fired explosive shells that easily punched through the top armor of German tanks and shredded half-tracks. Underwing rockets. Up to 8 massive, unguided rockets that could slice through a convoy like a scythe. 1,300 pounds of bombs. But the ultimate cheat code was unleashed at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in human history. Hitting a moving tank from an airplane was incredibly difficult, so the Soviets changed the math. They invented the PTAB bomblet, a tiny 5.5-pound canister carrying a shaped charge that could burn straight through tank armor. A single Sturmovik could pack over 200 of these bomblets into its bomb bays. Instead of trying to aim perfectly with a cannon, the pilot would simply fly low over a German Panzer division and scatter a massive carpet of black explosives. You didn't aim at one tank, you aimed at the whole field and let mathematics do the killing. To make it worse, Soviet pilots perfected a terrifying tactic called the Circle of Death. A massive group of Sturmoviks would form a rotating wheel in the sky over a target. One by one, they would peel off, dive, unleash hell, and climb back up into the wheel. For the Germans on the ground, the bombardment never stopped. But there is a dark, horrific reality to the Black Death that the Soviet propaganda reels completely ignored. To save weight and increase speed, the early Sturmoviks were built as single-seaters. They had no rear gunner. German fighter pilots quickly realized that while the Il-2 was an invincible fortress from the front, it was completely blind and defenseless from behind. They would slide into its blind spot and shoot it out of the sky. The Soviets panicked and added a second crewman, a rear gunner armed with a heavy machine gun to protect the tail. Here is the brutal cruelty of that decision. The armored bathtub did not protect the gunner. The pilot sat safely inside a thick cocoon of solid steel and heavy bulletproof glass. The teenage gunner, sitting just a few feet behind him, sat completely exposed in the open, with nothing but a thin sheet of canvas and aluminum at his back. The results were mathematically catastrophic. Rear gunners died at 4 times the rate of the pilots. They were flying the exact same mission, in the exact same sky, but the pilot rode in a tank, and the gunner rode in a coffin with the lid off. Whole squadrons learned not to make friends with their rear gunners. They were considered entirely expendable, often drawn from penal battalions and thrown into the seat at the last minute. It was a guaranteed death sentence. By the end of the war, Soviet factories had built an unfathomable 36,183 Sturmoviks. It remains the most produced combat aircraft in the history of the world, a literal river of mud-colored airplanes pouring westward. But building 36,000 of something means you are losing a massive amount of them. Across the war, over 10,700 Sturmoviks were shot out of the sky or smashed into the earth. That is nearly 1/3 of every single one ever built. In 1943 alone, they lost 3,500 planes. To fly the Black Death was to fly directly into the densest, most lethal anti-aircraft fire on the planet, day after day, until your luck ran out. The Soviets were losing up to 10 planes for every single Axis tank they destroyed. And yet, they kept coming. Ground crews would watch a Sturmovik land with 600 bullet holes punched through its fuselage, patch it with sheet metal, and send it back into the sky the very next morning. By the time Berlin fell, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had learned to dread that low, grinding drone coming over the tree line. The Sturmovik didn't just help win the war on the Eastern Front. It became the horrific soundtrack of a sky that had turned against them. It was an engineering marvel. It was an armored meat grinder. To Stalin, it was as necessary as the air they breathed. But to the men trapped on the ground beneath it, it was, and always will be, the Black Death.